Today, I'm very pleased to meet Mr. Peter Nixon, who very kindly agreed to be interviewed about self-esteem as it's so relevant in our modern world, especially how we communicate with different cultures and different ways of dealing with leaders and organizations. Peter Nixon is a subject matter expert, and you would wonder what that is. But actually, if you think about it deeply, any kind of negotiation, any kind of dialogue or communication is so relevant in building relationships, in building bonds and proper communications, and to lead to productive and profitable associations. So, Peter Nixon is an expert in his field. He's also an author of 5 business books. And he's trained and advised current and emerging leaders. So, thank you, Peter, for being here today. I mean, thank you for inviting me and agreeing to be interviewed today. So, Peter, tell me a little bit about yourself and where you are currently in terms of the pandemic, and then we'll get into self esteem.
Well, thank you so much for the chance to have the interview in the studio. This is my little studio that has become so important during the pandemic when we moved online and we communicate to clients this way. So we're all on Zoom, we're all live online, and sadly, not very much in person events happening. Although I do have a big event coming up later this month in Hong Kong, we're allowed to gather socially distanced. Will be 150 people talking about exactly the problem uh, with doctors on how to handle saving lives in a pandemic. They understand healthcare problems, they understand vaccines, and medical training doesn't necessarily include behavior change and leading people through a pandemic. So I don't pretend to have the answers, but they've been very kind to reach out and ask somebody with a background in dialogue and negotiation how we can help. So I do step out of the studio sometimes, and I welcome guests also. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. When I interviewed you for and requested you to share something about self esteem, which I feel is so relevant in our current environment, especially since we have a wider access um, as a result of technology to the world. And we communicate with different cultures and different kinds of personality types and different conditioning. So, you mentioned when I asked you a little bit about self esteem, you said that a lot of the times, Asian and American cultures, the way they manage and communicate in organizations may lead to misunderstandings because of different cultures and how they communicate. And a lot of the times, the Asians tend to rate themselves at a level below their real performance. This is because of their upbringing, where humility comes into the picture. So even if they are qualified, they always consider themselves less capable than they actually are. What do you think about this, Peter?
It's a very real problem. Uh, it's something that, as a Canadian growing up in Canada and then moving to Asia, I witnessed firsthand, but I've also witnessed it in my clients. And so I'll give you a personal example first. Being brought up in Canada, we were basically taught we could do anything and be anything we wanted, which is a great environment for building self-esteem. But I think when anyone climbs in their career and then goes international, they quickly realize there's a lot of competition out there, and there's a lot of space between where you're at and if you want to get to the top of your chosen field of endeavor. So that's a bit of a reality check if you come out of a small country that has a high self-esteem. If you come out of a big country that has a low self-esteem, either because it's just got a huge population and a lot of very evident competition, or because you might come out of a culture that reminds you to be humble and reminds you to be respectful of everyone who's got more talent and experience than you, you will arrive in this international arena with a different background. So that's what happened when I got to work with one of the large US investment banks. They were rolling out a global performance appraisal, and they were studying the results. An online performance appraisal, 360 degrees, where you get rated by your peers and your bosses and your subordinates, and you also rate yourself. And they found that people that came out of predominantly American, Canadian backgrounds rated themselves very high, 5 out of 5 on a whole different list of criteria. And then they looked at people with typically Asian background, and they rated themselves maybe 2 or 3 out of 5. And they knew, looking at the ratings, that a lot of that was caused by the cultural differences. They, of course, know the people and they know how good they are, and so they had to actually institute some correction to downgrade the people who rated themselves very high, but maybe thought themselves better than people that had rated themselves lower. And that's necessary in any multinational, because you want to make sure that the best people are getting the promotions, and it has to be fair.
Yes, it has to be fair. You're right. So, how would you think about women in the workplace and the culture and diversity issues that sometimes exist? How do you advise people to deal with such situations?
Well, that's also a challenge, right? So as a man, I'm not sure should I be qualified to comment, but I can share examples where I have been asked by women's groups or by female executives in their companies. For example, I was asked by 2 female executives in Korea, how should they respond to the glass ceiling that they faced. One responded by quitting the employer and working for an American employer in Korea, because they knew that they could get ahead in a US culture company in Korea. The other, her classmate, they were friends, so a nice comparison. So equally qualified, equally talented, but was working for a Korean organization in Korea, and hit the glass ceiling and realized she could not proceed any higher unless she left the company, and she didn't want to leave the company because she wanted to work for a Korean employer.
I see.
So what did I do with the Korean company? I strongly recommended that they promote females, to reflect the diversity of their workforce. And they went ahead and did that. And within 6 months, the female executive quit. And of course she quit because they made it impossible for her to stay in position and enjoy her job. She hit roadblock after roadblock. Okay. So it's very challenging for sure.
And what would you say? Okay, because my book, Self-esteem in a Selfie World, and I've brought a lot of incidents related to social media, the effects of social networking sites on people's self-esteem. Do you have any thoughts or comments about whether social media is relevant, is helpful, or does really have a negative impact on I'm focusing more on corporate professionals or graduates or people who are on a career path. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I do actually, and I have you to thank for teaching me as well more on this subject. And as I self-reflect, I've been approached by some people who want to join my network because I have a lot of followers. But at 4,000 or 5,000 followers, I don't have a lot of followers. I have a friend that has 75,000 followers, and I wonder, well, what do you do to get 75,000 followers, and what do I need to do differently? I think social media on very many different levels makes it incredibly transparent for you to compare yourself with others. And that's a new phenomenon that we didn't have, and we need to figure out how to do that. So I'm really looking forward to reading more of your book and learning not just how that can help me, but how that can help me help others who are also facing that challenge, especially in the pandemic, as consultants like myself are all moving online and comparing themselves with other people online in terms of video, likes, retweets, comments, all of the above. It's a challenge for all of us.
So I'm going to ask you a very interesting question here, Peter. I think it's quite interesting because when you have met so many interesting characters like thought leaders and politicians and powerful individuals, have you ever experienced that they struggle with self-esteem issues?
My answer is yes, and here's how I know that. Because of the nature of my work, I get to work with some very senior people who entrust in me a certain amount of confidence and share their challenges so that I can help them. And they go from being in the public sphere to inviting me into a boardroom, maybe with their team or maybe alone over a coffee or a drink, and they tell me something in private. And it's when we have those private sessions that you start to realize that the public persona that looks so strong and invincible in private is not really strong and invincible. And I'll give you an example. I was speaking with somebody who knew Bill Clinton in school, and they remained friends. And then Bill Clinton becomes elected president of the United States, and he said to my friend, yesterday I was a lawyer, and today I'm the president of the United States. What do I do? And whether that's true or not true, that was recounted to me. But it's a good example of we're all human, and we've all come from very humble beginnings, regardless of how much opportunity and wealth and knowledge that we have built up. We're still pretty much first time in those situations as leaders. And like right now in the pandemic, I mean, nobody alive was in a big pandemic in the last Spanish flu. So what do we do? What's right? How do we behave? And in all honesty, we don't know. And so we try to put on a tough personal image in public and then figure out in private what do we do and how do we do it better. And that's why I always promote the solutions in the dialogue, because the world's too complicated today, too volatile for any one person to have it all figured out. We need to talk, we need to share. And it's good to share our vulnerabilities too, because when we say we don't know, people might step up and help us with what they know, or at least their perspective of what they think they understand of the situation. And that will help us. Together, we can solve this.
That's so true, actually, Peter. You pointed out a very important situation where people in the workplace or in organizations, many people just want to put up a very strong front. They don't want to share their vulnerabilities. They feel that that shows a sign of weakness or incapability at completing a job. But actually sharing doubts, sharing one's issues with other people who are professionals, who can help. I think that's the kind of corporate culture that we do need in this day and age, to support each other, to build each other up rather than to compare and compete. And have you ever felt that there have been certain individuals who initially carried the sense of self-doubt and then became great leaders and showed great potential through your communication with them and understanding of themselves? Have you noticed changes in people?
Well, that's an interesting question. Have I ever worked with somebody who recognized that they had that self-doubt and then overcame it? Yes, I think I don't think really good leaders recognize that they're really good leaders until they're in really difficult situations. And so I've worked with people that led through the tsunami that wiped out so many people back in 2004, was it? I've worked with people that were involved in 911 in the World Trade Center. Uh, so people in 7/7 in London. Some accuse me of always being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but uh, fortunately, I've survived all of those incidences, and I've found that those leaders, when thrown into those situations that they never expected to be in, rose to the top. Uh, they all had self-doubt. No one believed that they could do it. No one believed that they would ever be in those situations. But through personal principles and belief, they rose to the top because they did the right thing at the right time. And so I'll give you an example. One of my clients in Thailand came to the rescue of their employees, families, who had been wiped out by the tsunami. And the company owner was refusing to pay the hospital bills. And the management team, who were outside of the ownership structure, the management team chose to pay for the family expenses at the hospital. And then years later, I met the employees, and they were so incredibly grateful because they know that the management team went out of their way to look after them personally. And so they not just earned their trust, but proved their strength as leaders. And they share those examples now as examples of where they overcame their own self-doubt. And they're highly respected as leaders now in the organization globally for what they did. But if you ask them at the time, did you think you were going to do the right thing or be a good leader? They would say absolutely not. They were just scared beyond belief. But they did what they thought was right. And to me, that's really the definition of a good leader, is she or he does the right thing at the right time, even if that means a cost to themselves. And in these difficult, trying times, we see both types of leaders. We see leaders who run away. For example, they're trying to push public mandate for vaccinations onto private sector. And then we see other leaders who are stepping up and trying to get all of their people vaccinated and masked, and embracing compassionately those who have fears and maybe religious reasons for not wanting to do so. So it's not easy, right? It's not a popularity contest, but they're doing their best in the most difficult situations. So we can only have compassion. I've also found that the people with the least self-esteem seem to have the most to say of value in the dialogues that I've conducted inside organizations. And there seems to be a link between their lack of self-esteem, meaning they don't talk up much, and if they don't speak up much in the organization, that means they spend a lot of time watching and listening, which means for an organizational consultant to walk in, these people are gems because they know everything, they've heard everything, they've watched everything, and we give them full respect, and they open up and they share, and we say thank you, and we protect their identities so that there's no recrimination, but that also builds their self-esteem. So when I say the solution is in the dialogue, this goes quite deep into not just who is in the dialogue, but what are the issues and how do we surface those issues so we can come up with the best decisions in the most difficult situations.
Thank you, Peter. That was amazing what you shared. And I loved how you shared that sometimes people in organizations are quiet and they don't talk about what they're doing, but they listen and they learn a lot, and they struggle with low self-esteem. But then learning from them, you actually give them a chance to develop themselves and encourage them to develop their self-esteem. So it's what you say about a person with strong self-belief and a resilient attitude can achieve their full potential. So anybody with a low self-esteem can develop and become strong and recognize their strengths, and with the humility and compassion, they can develop themselves as well and pursue their goals to their fullest potentials. So thank you very much for joining me, and thank you, Peter, for this lovely sharing of what of your journey and your experiences. And look forward to connecting with you again. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.